Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I am going to be reviewing Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. I just recently finished reading this, and I want to say thank you to everybody who voted on my January TBR video and picked this as the viewer pick. I did read this book and I started a read along with it, which is still ongoing if you're interested in joining, and I really enjoyed this book. So to review this book today, I'm going to do a long form standalone review on it, but I'm going to split it into two sections. The first part of this video is just going to be a short, quick review of the book in case you're interested in reading it. It will contain no spoilers, and it will be set up kind of how I do my weekly reviews, where I will just share a little bit about what this book is about, the different topics it contains, what I found as high and lows in the book, and then I will tell you what my rating of the book was and who I would recommend read this book. The second half of the video is going to go more in depth into all of the facets of a book that I consider when I am trying to decide my rating of it. I'm going to talk about the plot, the characters, the narration of the story, all the themes and symbolism and language that's used in here, as well as talk a bit about Ralph Ellison's own backgrounds and intentions in working this book. And at the end of the day, just a thorough evaluation as to how successful I think this book is in and of itself and how successful Ralph Ellison was in trying to achieve his goals. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to start by telling you a bit of what this book is about. So Invisible Man, after having read it, I would say is a book that tells the story of an unnamed narrator, and we'll go more in depth into how I think the narrator kind of does give himself a name, but you'll just have to wait until we get to that part. For now, we'll just say that the narrator is unnamed and it's his first person narration and experience of life in America. And he shares the story of how he goes from the deep south to New York City to find work and his experiences of life in both places and that are radically different in a lot of ways, and how he ends up at the end and in some ways at the beginning in a very dark space. This book, at the end of the day, covers a lot of different topics, including race and racism, politics in America, identity, power, education, music. It's pretty thorough. The number of things it discusses, and we'll talk about how well that may or may not be handled in the book. So let's discuss what I thought was a major high in this book, and that would have to be the characters and characterization. First and foremost, the book is narrated in the first person by the protagonist of the book, and the voice of our narrator is just a very strong voice. It's very clear and well written most of the time. And you really connect to the narrator. I think he is very self-aware, if not gullible at times. And it's an interesting tension. There's definitely that sense where you question how reliable your narrator is. You definitely get a deep experience, however, of the idea that everything you're seeing is really how he perceives the world. And so in that sense, I personally think all first-person narrators are unreliable. Despite that, however, you find yourself, or at least I found myself, very invested in this character's life and the outcome of his story. You begin sort of at the end, and his story really is about telling you how he got there. And I cared enough about this character that I wanted to find out, even though there were things in his story and life that he told that were difficult to hear recounted. There were points in the book that I felt were a little bit confusing, but I really just wanted to know what happened to this character. That was how strongly I was invested in his outcome. And I think that is just the brilliance of how Ralph Ellison wrote the voice of this character was he makes you care about him. There are a lot of other characters in this book, but I think there is really good characterization done of them as well, so you don't reach the point where they're too confusing. You're introduced to them at a good pace. They are well characterized. They each have distinct personalities, and especially personalities that are separate from that of our narrator. I very rarely had a hard time keeping track of people, despite the number of people that there are in this book. I always find that very impressive. One of the lows for me in reading this book, however, did occasionally have to do with the writing. And this was me maybe getting really picky at this point because there were a lot of things that I liked about the writing style. I think the writing of this book is very modern in style and feels very contemporary, and it's very distinct. Like, I feel like if somebody quoted me any random line from this book, I would probably identify it as being Ralph Ellison's writing. That said, there were times in the book where the writing style just got a bit surrealistic and dreamlike. Times that was intentional, and I caught that and I loved it, but there were other times where it was a bit muddled and unclear, and I couldn't tell whether this was a dream or dreamlike sequence or whether this was just like the writing sort of getting out of hand. That's the best way that I could describe it. It seemed like there were times where the writing was just getting away from Ralph Ellison. I'm not always a big fan of stream of consciousness, and this book definitely went in that direction with the writing style at times. All that said, I did end up rating this book initially 4 stars, but after going back and thinking about it further and having spent more time sitting with it, I'm actually going to bump that up to 4.5 stars because even though I mentioned a couple of lows, in reviewing it, I realized they are really sort of nitpicky things, and they're not something that would stop me from rereading this book or recommending it to people. I think it's just something that kind of slows me down and caused me to stumble a bit in the book a few times and almost made me want to stop reading it, but didn't. So it definitely impacted my score and kept this from being a complete 5 star for me, but wasn't like a major hit to the book. I would recommend this book to anyone who is interested in reading about a different perspective on life in America, particularly in the 30s and 40s. This is also good for anyone who wants to read a book that discusses race relationships in the US during that time, who likes to consider the themes of identity, self discovery, or invisibility in society. And this is also a great book for people who like literary fiction, who like character driven novels, and like a lot of symbolism in their books. So that is everything I would say in short. Let me get into my longer review of this book. Like I said, I'm going to go into each section of this book that I rated, and for each of those sections, I'm going to talk about what my highs and lows were. So you might want to get a little snack, a drink of water, something, settle in, because this is going to be the long review. And as I did with the short review, I'm largely going to try and avoid doing any spoilers in case you yourself would like to pick up this excellent book. I'm also going to do myself the favor of not holding the book the entire time. We all know that I'm talking about Invisible Man, right? So let's just get straight into it. I'm going to start by talking about the plot and structure of this book. So let's start by talking about the structure of this book. This is a non-linear book. The plot is non-traditional in the way it is formatted, and I would say this is sort of a circularly plotted book in terms of where you begin and where you end is in the same place. So you start in the middle of the action with our narrator, even though it's during an inactive time, it's in the middle of action for him, as you later learn, and the narrator starts in a dark place where he just tells you about himself, and then through a series of flashbacks and conversations that he has with basically you, the reader, the narrator of the story tells us how he got to being in what seems like a dark cave. While the pacing of this book overall was pretty good, it was also sort of a low for me at times. For the vast majority of the book, I would say it is medium to fast paced and moves really well along from one event to the next, rather fluidly, sometimes in a dreamlike sensation. And I mean like dreamlike to the point where I felt like if this was a movie, it should be like that old fashioned like waving of the screen with that like sound effect going on in the background where the next scene is suddenly in black and white or super saturated. Like, you know what I'm talking about, right? While I would say the pacing in this book was rather consistent, it was not static. It did change at times. You definitely had some rapid action based changes in pacing that were rather quick. And then I think most of the time, quite appropriately, the pacing would slow down to give you time to reflect. In fact, there were some situations where I felt like I needed more time to reflect on the events that just happened. And it was something that I think we all commented on in reading this book that while the book is sort of medium to fast paced in terms of how quickly events are gone through, it is a book that because so much happens in each moment, you end up reading the book slowly. My biggest qualm with the pacing in the book, however, were there were a couple of moments where the timing and the pacing of events really slowed down. We really got into deep detail in a moment, and there were a few times where it just didn't feel appropriate. It felt like too much, and it felt like it slowed the story down um, to make me reflect on something that I didn't end up getting a lot out of, and I don't think majorly moved the book forward. Chapter 5. I'm talking about chapter 5 in the book. I think it would have been more effective to just give us portions of the speech and continue moving on. Other than a few moments that were like that, where the pacing was just slowed down too much and we spent too long on something, I'd say the vast majority of the time, there were some major points that all fit in really well. You had lots of developmental points for a character, a ton of different and varied events that majorly impacted who he was, drove the story forward. At times, it felt really real and really current and very present. And at times it just felt bizarre and surreal. And you felt like, is he dreaming? Am I dreaming? And I loved it. I thought it was so well handled and so well developed and just really unique way of traversing about the space. There were times where I just really felt like I was in somebody's mind experiencing life as they experienced it. And I think rare is the author who is able to so clearly develop what the human experience is like, and what it's like to see through somebody else's eyes in a variety of different events. He gets not just the realism of what's happening, but how life truly can at times feel dreamlike or bizarre, or how we don't always understand what's happening to us as it's happening. The characterization as a whole was one of my favorite aspects of this book. So, first and foremost, I've talked a lot about the protagonist of this book, who is, for the most part, unnamed. And the reason I'm hedging on that is because there is one aspect where our narrator doesn't have a name. And the reason he has no name is actually explained in the book, but he does kind of hint at his name at different times. One, he gives you a name to call him, somewhat tongue-in-cheek. He, at one point in the very beginning of the book, refers to himself and says, "You can call me, call me Jack." And so I called him Jack throughout the book, and in discussing this with viewers on the story graph, just to have a name to go with. And it seems legitimate to me. Like, the character that he's using for Jack is sort of a character that may or may not be someone that you would want to use to characterize your own self, because they have a lot of negative qualities as well as good qualities. But it reminds me of Ishmael and Moby Dick, where the name Ishmael has a lot of positive and negative connotations attached to it as well. But it seems to me a legitimate thing, especially since he says, "Call me Jack." Getting into the characterization of our protagonist, he starts as a developed man who is in the dark, having a very deep experience, knowing himself, knowing his place in the world, and being pretty set with that, but wanting to explain it further to the reader. He then takes us back to his time in college, and we get to go on the journey of self-discovery and self-identification that he has. We see great character development in him during this time, starting from college, where he is young but not dumb, but rather accepting and gullible to everything that the world throws at him, including the other characters that come up. And that gets me a bit into the other characters in this book. There are a lot of other characters in this book. Like in life, as he journeys from the South to the North in the US, he meets a variety of different people. I was very impressed by the variety of different types of people that he would meet. Some of them were similar in that they played similar roles, but they were still very distinct from one another in their behaviors, their mindsets, their attitudes, their treatment. He met a lot of men. I would say the vast majority of people in this book are men, and that does seem to be very intentional. And these men play roles anywhere from being mentors and guiders to just important men, powerful men, to the evil villains. This is definitely a book that is like man versus society, as far as that goes. A lot of the characters in this book are rounded out in some manner. Some of them are static, but a lot of it seems to be for a purpose. If there is a character that is sort of almost a caricature of people, it seems to be more because it's symbolic as opposed to just poor characterization. Getting back to our protagonist and his journey of self discovery, we are given a lot of ideas of what his motivations are in the book. And I appreciated the fact that his motivations developed and changed as he developed and changed as a person. So we got to see him not only grow in his self identification and his desire to be an activist, but we also saw his motivations develop from just simply wanting to survive and make it to wanting to do something for himself, to wanting to do something for others and those around him, and trying to figure out what and how to do that. He just had really interesting relationships with people. It was interesting to see who he chose to be involved with quickly versus who he didn't. He had very odd relationships with women. Even that I felt like was pretty well explained. And there was a lot of like symbolism and meaning built into each and every relationship. I really appreciated the settings that Ralph Ellison put in this book. None of them, again, were accidental. They seem to all serve a greater purpose other than just to have, a place for the characters to put their feet on, if you will. There were three main settings in this book. One would be the cave that you're in at the beginning of the book, or the dark space. The second would be the college in the Deep South, and the third would be different parts of New York City. And each of these places continued to have meaning throughout the book as they were introduced. They were well described, they were part of the character's development, as well as having heavy symbolism. The initial space where our character starts is part of his experience and opening as well as closing of the book, and is initially important to the plot in terms of just getting buy-in by the reader, and ends up being important to the plot in terms of being part of bringing the story full circle. The college setting is definitely a beautiful setting that is described and is significant in sort of the origin story, if you will, of our protagonist. And New York City is the place that is used as the great developing point of the story. Each of these locations also has major impact on our character, and I was really impressed on how Ralph Ellison developed each of these areas to impact our character. The college setting definitely, like I said, had an impact on his initial thoughts about life and his early, like, childhood development, if you will. New York City, like I said, was definitely the place of new learning, of maturation, of maturity. It impacted our character in the way he thought, in the way he lived, who he was involved in, and really symbolized a space of learning and growth as well as hardship. And finally, that dark space that he is in is really kind of like being inside your own mind. That's how I felt about it. I felt like it's the place of interior dialogue. It's the place where our character is given rest from the outside world and truly gets to take a time out from everything that has gone on in this book up to that point and sit with his own thoughts. And so to me, that dark space kind of ended up symbolizing the interior life. And I really loved how it worked out, especially at the end of the story, once you understood where he was. It still was sort of a bizarre setting for him to be in, but it worked so well. So, I mentioned earlier what some of the major topics this book discussed, such as race and identity and invisibility and power and race relations and political activism. All of these are ideas that are discussed in this book. Let me just say that this book would be great for any book group because there is just so much to talk about and so much to discuss. And he just gets you to think about all of these things in depth over and over again at deeper and deeper levels. He challenges your thoughts on them in having the protagonist change his thoughts on the idea. You definitely question as you get towards the middle and end of the book whether you agree with any of the ideas being presented. So I would say that if you read this book, an idea is presented at the beginning that you don't agree with, stick with it, challenge the idea, even if you do agree with it, and, don't settle on a decision as to whether you think something is right or wrong just because it's presented. I think that's a lot of what this book does well, is helping a reader realize that just because somebody said something is good doesn't mean that it is. Like, he really gets you, as he gets the narrator, to critically think about all of these topics that are presented. I do think he does a good job of sharing what his message is and what his perspective is, even if you don't agree with him. Next, I want to talk about the language or style in which the book was written. And I did mention that this was part of the book that I had the most issues with at times. At times, the prose and syntax was very simple. There were other times where it was much more complex. As I mentioned, there were a few moments where it went into a kind of stream of consciousness slash dreamlike sequence in terms of how it was written. Sometimes I found that very beautiful and lifelike, and other times it just seemed confusing and muddled, and I don't think was supposed to be. There was definitely one point in the book where it was supposed to be really confusing and muddled and then got explained as to why that happened. And I really appreciated that section of the book. At the end of the day, I thought this just showed what mastery Ralph Ellison has in writing, in his ability to sort of use his sentence and sentence structure to help carry you into the mind of another person. There were quite a few symbols and motifs in the book, and I wrote it down, so I'll share with you what some of them are. I broke them up into different categories, so I'm just going to read off my list here. Let me pull it up so I can see it more easily. So there were a lot of symbols and motifs surrounding people, including the grandfather, Dr. Bledsoe, Tayton, and the women in the book were actually very symbolic. The colors, particularly black and white, were used to have a lot of different meanings, and sometimes pretty consistent meanings. There were objects like envelopes, a coin bank, briefcase, machines, and there were different events that ended up being motifs that were used throughout the book, including dream sequences and the battle royal. And I also want to mention cigarettes and smoke. This was used so consistently and so well that as I got partway through the book, anytime somebody started smoking, I was just filled with dread. And not due to their health. Literally, it just became a sign of like, there's something underhanded going on here and things are going to go downhill and go bad. And I was also very suspicious of white envelopes. Like, I don't think I've ever been like so like, oh no, there's a white envelope. What's going on? What's going to happen next? But that was just how well he used the symbols and motifs in the book, that like just having an object appear on the page or in a scene could automatically trigger a reaction in me as the reader. And that is not something that I have experienced a lot in books, even ones that have had symbolism or motifs. I find that sometimes there are motifs that exist, which are just reoccurring images or phrases in a book, but it's not always clear what their meaning is supposed to be. And here, I think he did a good job of not beating you over the head with what their meaning is supposed to be, but giving you enough context for you as a reader to figure out some meaning in that symbol, even if it was just a bad things are about to happen. This book is definitely one that has left a lasting impression on me, and I think will leave a lasting impression on just about anybody who reads it. I don't think it's the easiest book to get through, but I also don't think it's the hardest book to get through. It's just definitely a book that plays with your emotions and makes you wonder if things are going to work out okay, and if our narrator is going to make the right or best decision for him or those around you. And I think that's all very intentional. It's part of being invested in the character that you want things to work out, and it's part of the genius of the writing that you're truly not sure if they will. I think both for me and historically, this book was very unique in terms of its writing and plotting and topic that was discussed. And I think it will continue to be so. I don't feel like I've read another book that was exactly like this. I think it talked about very familiar things, but in a very different and unique way, all the way from the way it was structured to the plot and the different events that happens and the way all of that is told. I would say overall, this is a very well written book, even though I have issues here and there with the writing style. I still think the writing style overall is very strong and amazing. And I think the characters in here, as well as the plot, are just endlessly ripe with meaning and joy and sorrow and just encompass a wide variety of the human experience. Those are all of my thoughts on this book, and I hope that can help you see why I gave this book a 4.5 stars. Pretty much everything I mentioned was just excellently done. I hope it gives you an idea of some of the features and things that you can look for in this book and a clearer idea on how I rate my books. I really thought this book was just a masterful work of fiction. I'm not at all surprised it's considered a classic. I think this would be a great book to teach in any literature class and is just a fantastic book to read. I cannot say enough about it. I'm so happy that I got to read this, and I'm so glad that I got to read it with some of you and that there were people who participated in the, 1 day read along that I did for it, that there are people who are participating in the read along that I'm hosting on the Story Graph. That is open until the end of the year. So if you haven't read this book and you've watched this really long review and now want to read this book, do. And if it's still 2025, you can still join the read along and I will still read your comments on there. So you can join me there. We can read this together, kind of, sort of, not really. And yeah, I think that's all that I have to say about this book at this point. And I hope that if you read it, you enjoyed it. I hope you liked this video. Like and subscribe so you can hear about other books that I'm reading in great, great detail. And that's it for me today. I will talk to you next time. Bye.